Hey everyone, welcome back to Unplugged Headlines Podcast. We're pumped for another deep dive, kicking off episode 23.
Absolutely.
Ready to get into it.
Let's do it.
All right, so today we're tackling this piece, kind of grabbed our attention. Tariffs, short-term gains, long-term losses, why they work until they don't.
Catchy title.
Right, definitely makes you think. So basically we're going to break down tariffs, those taxes on imported stuff. Figure out why they seem like a good idea at first.
But then maybe not so much in the long run.
Exactly. Like, is it just a quick fix that blows up later?
Well, this blog post jumps right in, reminds us tariffs have been around forever.
Seriously?
Yeah, like way back, ancient times.
Hmm.
As long as folks have been trading across borders, someone's been trying to slap a tax on it.
So why are we still debating them if they've been around for so long?
Good question. I think that's exactly what this post gets at. They're kind of tricky. Useful sometimes, but the long game, that's where things get messy.
All right, so let's unpack that.
Yeah.
When do governments actually use tariffs? The post mentions a few reasons, right?
Right. One is to protect industries back home that are, struggling. Classic example, U.S. steel industry.
Yeah. Always hear about that.
So they've gotten tariff protection on and off for ages. The idea is it gives them a chance to, adapt.
Adapt to what?
To whatever's changing in the market, global competition, new tech, without, huge job losses right away.
So it buys them time. Makes sense on the surface.
But then the post kind of nudges us, asks, does that really fix anything? Or does it just kick the can down the road? Maybe even stifle innovation because they're not forced to compete.
Ooh, good point. Like, they get comfy, don't need to improve as much.
Exactly. Short-term relief, maybe, but does it make them stronger in the long run? Not necessarily.
So what else? Besides saving industries, why else use tariffs?
Well, they can be a bargaining chip. The Post uses the example of the U.S. putting tariffs on South Korean steel back in 2018.
I vaguely remember that. Was that about trade deals?
Exactly. It wasn't really about keeping those tariffs forever, more like using them as leverage to get South Korea to make some changes in the Chorus Agreement.
So pressure tactics. Do this or the tariffs stay.
Right. Tariffs as a negotiating tool means to an end. Get what you want, then ideally tariffs go away.
Interesting. So not just protecting industries, but also for leverage in these international deals. What else did the Post mention?
Well, it brought up something kind of historical. Back in the day, governments used tariffs as a way to, make money.
Wait, really?
Yeah, before income taxes were, the norm, tariffs were a main source of revenue, especially for developing countries. Simpler to collect at the border.
Huh. Never thought of it that way. Clever, but I guess not as common anymore. Anything else about why tariffs get used?
One more thing, the Post points out the whole political side of it. Putting a tariff on something, it sends a message, right?
Oh, we're doing something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To the industries that are hurting, to the voters, it shows action, even if economically the tariff might not be the best solution.
It's a good look, politically. Makes people feel heard.
Right. Like with the Phase 1 trade deal with China in 2020, they used tariffs to push for stuff like stronger intellectual property protection and to get China to buy more agricultural products.
Did that eventually fizzle out?
Yeah. The Post mentions those tariffs weren't meant to be permanent, and they did get rolled back partially later. Again, more of a short-term tactic to achieve specific goals.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered some reasons for tariffs, but this piece is called Why They Work Until They Don't. So what's the catch?
Well, the big one the Post digs into is retaliation.
Oh, yeah, the whole trade war thing.
Exactly. You hit them with a tariff, they hit back with one of their own. It can escalate quickly.
And it gets personal, right? Like, they target things that'll hurt.
Oh, absolutely. They gave the example of when the EU responded to those U.S. steel tariffs in 2018. They didn't just randomly choose stuff.
What'd they do?
They hit back with tariffs on American bourbon, motorcycles, things that would cause pain in politically sensitive areas.
Ouch. A shot of Kentucky bourbon. That's hitting below the belt.
Right, and that's the danger with using tariffs long term. They can spiral out of control and everyone loses.
Okay, so retaliation's a biggie. But who really pays the price for all these tariffs flying around?
Well, the Post makes it pretty clear it's the consumers and businesses too. They end up paying higher prices.
Makes sense. If it costs more to import, that cost gets passed along.
Right. The example they used, remember those washing machine tariffs a few years back?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, the Post cited some research showing that those tariffs basically acted like a hidden tax. Consumers ended up paying way more for washing machines, and the cost per job saved in the U.S. washing machine industry was crazy high. Not exactly efficient.
Not a great deal for anyone except maybe a few washing machine companies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings up another long-term problem with tariffs. They can make industries less efficient over time.
How so?
Well, if companies are shielded from competition from abroad for too long, they don't have as much incentive to innovate, to get better, to cut costs.
They get lazy.
Basically. The Post uses the American auto industry as an example. Back in the late 20th century, they had a lot of protection from foreign car makers, and, well, they struggled to keep up when those protections went away. They weren't as competitive on the global stage.
Yeah, I remember that. Buy American campaigns and all that.
And nowadays, things are even more complicated because of...
Global supply chains. Everything's so interconnected.
Exactly. The Post points out how a tariff on one little thing, like an imported part, can mess things up for a whole bunch of manufacturers here in the U.S. They mentioned how steel tariffs could backfire on companies that make cars or appliances.
Because those industries need steel.
Right. It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
You raise the cost of one thing and it ripples through the whole system, hurting the very industries you're trying to protect.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess on top of all the economic stuff, there's the whole impact on, like, international relations.
Absolutely. The Post talks about how throwing tariffs around all the time can really strain relationships with other countries.
Makes sense. It's
Yeah.
basically saying, we don't trust you, we don't want to trade fairly.
Yeah. And that can spill over into other areas too. Diplomacy, security cooperation, environmental issues, all kinds of stuff.
Speaking of bad international vibes, we can't talk about tariffs without bringing up Smoot-Hawley. Right, that whole 1930 debacle.
The Post called it a historical catastrophe. And yeah, for good reason. It's like the poster child for how not to do tariffs.
What happened again? Refresh my memory.
Basically, the U.S. slapped huge tariffs on tons of imported goods.
Why'd they do that?
They thought it would protect American jobs during the Depression, but it totally backfired.
How?
While other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, global trade basically froze up and things got way worse for everyone. It actually deepened the Depression.
So Smoot-Hawley is a classic cautionary tale. Don't mess around with big long-term tariffs.
Right. It shows how interconnected the global economy is and how screwing with that balance can have massive unintended consequences.
Got it. Now, the Post also gets into how the specifics of implementing tariffs matter a lot. Like, is it a gradual thing or sudden, broad or targeted, all that?
Absolutely. The speed and scope make a huge difference in how the market reacts. They compared those gradual tariff reductions we saw in the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the sudden tariffs during the trade war with China. When it's predictable, businesses have time to adjust, minimize disruption. Sudden shocks, not so much.
Makes sense. And then there's the whole question of whether a tariff is seen as temporary or permanent. That changes things too, right?
For sure. A temporary tariff, businesses might just grit their teeth and bear it. But if it's permanent, well, then they got to rethink their whole game plan, where they get their supplies, where they invest everything.
That's the signaling effect the Post talked about. Temporary means blip on the radar. Permanent means tectonic shift.
Exactly. Predictability is key for business investment, and that's where clear, stable tariff policies are so important. NAFTA is mentioned as an example of a trade agreement that, while not perfect, at least provided that stability for a good while.
Versus the whole U.S.-China thing, which was so up in the air for so long.
Right. Businesses just didn't know what to expect, which can really hurt investment and economic growth.
So bottom line, what does all the economic data say about tariffs in the long run?
Well, the Post cites a bunch of studies from places like the World Bank showing that countries that consistently rely on high tariffs tend to have slower economic growth.
Interesting. So it's not just a theory. It's backed up by actual evidence.
Yeah. Open trade, fewer tariffs, generally equals better economic performance. It suggests those benefits efficiency, innovation, all that they outweigh the costs of competition.
Makes you wonder why anyone would use them long term then.
Well, as we said before, there are sometimes strategic reasons. Like, remember the infant industry argument. The Post used South Korea's car and steel industries as an example. They got temporary protection to get on their feet, but it was paired with policies to push them toward being competitive globally. Eventually, those protections went away.
So it's like training wheels, but with a clear plan to take them off eventually.
Exactly. You're not just propping them up indefinitely, you're helping them develop the strength to ride on their own.
Smart. The Post also mentioned national security, right?
Yeah, protecting vital industries for national security reasons can be a justification for tariffs. But the Post warns against using that too broadly. it can become an excuse for protectionism.
Like everything suddenly becomes vital to national security.
Right. Got to be careful with that one. And then the last exception they mention is using tariffs to counter, like, really unfair trade practices. Things like dumping, where a country floods the market with super cheap goods to kill off competition.
Or when governments give their companies huge subsidies so they can sell stuff for way less than it actually costs to make.
Exactly. In those cases, the Post suggests tariffs could be used to level the playing field. But it emphasizes the need for clear evidence that these practices are actually happening, not just using it as an excuse for protectionism.
So wrapping things up, what's the big takeaway from this whole discussion?
Well, the Post closes with this great analogy. They bring up that famous quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it."
Oh yeah, Santayana, right. Deep stuff.
Right. And the point is, with tariffs, we've got centuries of history to learn from. They might seem tempting as a quick fix, but time and time again, they've caused more trouble than they're worth in the long run, both for economies and for international relations.
They work as tactics, but they fail as strategies. That's a good way to put it.
Definitely. So next time you hear about some new tariff proposal, think about those historical examples. Think about those economic principles. Is it truly a strategic move, a temporary thing, or is it just repeating the same mistakes that have gotten us in trouble before?
Awesome. Thanks for breaking all that down. This was a really insightful deep dive. And to our listeners, if you're curious to learn more, we encourage you to dig a little deeper into those historical examples. See how tariffs played out in different situations. It's a fascinating and often cautionary tale. Thanks for tuning in to Unplugged Headlines.
Catch you next time.